The Bloodline Civil War is officially here, and we found that out on this week's edition of SmackDown from Detroit, as it was Solo Sikoa and the debuting Tama Tonga who took center stage here with a very scared Paul Heyman after it was Solo and Tama who kicked out Jimmy Uso from this version of the Bloodline, and that is where the importance lies, because there are now going to be two versions of the Bloodline, it seems like, moving forward. And we were wondering, how are they going to carry the story forward without Roman Reigns for a while, without The Rock for a while? Here it is. And there are more superstars, as we know, to come that will be joining this mix. But they have now set up a very interesting dynamic, because if we go back several months ago, and you guys can see the visual here, right? If we go back several months, you had this situation where it was Roman Reigns who was anointing Solo Sikoa as the next tribal chief. The tribal prince, whatever you wanted to call him now, that's what he was labeled as. And Jimmy Uso thought it was going to be him. Roman really played it up, and then he asked Jimmy to join him in congratulating Solo, his brother, as the next tribal chief. So Roman was confident then that he was going to hand the keys over to Solo Sikoa. Well, as Paul Heyman said on this week's edition of SmackDown, there are consequences, right? Wins and losses matter, and I know people will make the joke about Solo's not so great win-loss record. But if you take it a little bit further beyond that, it is one where they've now lost the championship to Cody Rhodes, and they were pointing out how they'll get the locker room back once they get the title back from Cody, which is a longer play in this story, as we know. But what was really important here is the fact, of course, how Solo responded. And we mentioned in a previous video, at WrestleMania 40, the tensions were rising between Solo Sikoa and Roman Reigns in the Night 2 main event with Cody Rhodes, after it was Solo who started yelling at Roman Reigns, basically out of nowhere, because he wanted Roman to finish Cody Rhodes. He kept yelling at Roman, finish him, finish him. And Roman's yelling back, I know, I know. And so you teased that frustration that was there from Solo. And we had also pointed out previously, if you looked at some of the visuals, Solo had started moving away from Roman Reigns much more than he had before. At one point, they were a tight unit. But then Solo started moving closer to The Rock, as we showed in some of the visuals in previous videos. So, is this where we're headed? Because now, what did we see on this week's edition of SmackDown? A very similar visual, right? It was Solo stepping up to Jimmy, giving him basically that same embrace that we've seen Roman Reigns give when he's about to send the hit on someone. And it was Solo who did just that by orders of the tribal chief. Now we know that Solo's tribal chief and Paul Heyman's tribal chief are no longer the same tribal chief. And now that leads us into a very interesting dynamic as we move forward. The question was always, how are they going to bring back Roman Reigns? And my thought was, hey, maybe they just bring Roman back once things get to Cody versus The Rock. If they do that at SummerSlam, which who knows at this point, may be unlikely. But now I think it's very clear how they're going to bring Roman Reigns back. You're going to have someone else join the mix in this Bloodline scenario. We know Jimmy is now on the other side, right? We know that Solo and Tama Tonga are aligned together. There's going to have to be another member added into the mix for Solo and Tama Tonga. Who is that going to be? Spoiler alert, if you don't want to know who that's going to be, you can continue, fast forward this video, go watch another video. But we know that Jacob Fatu has now been signed to WWE. And so it makes a lot of sense, wouldn't it, for the new tribal chief, whoever that is, for Solo Sikoa and Tama Tonga, which we have a pretty good idea that ultimately it could be The Rock that is revealed as the new tribal chief. And he is the one giving the orders to Solo Sikoa and Tama Tonga. Or do they make Jacob Fatu the new tribal chief? I don't think that's the direction they go. But, hey, if you want to throw a guy into a very prominent role right away, that would be one way to do it. However, if you want to play to the larger story of how this could play out, and as always, we're just making predictions here. They could be right, they could be wrong, but this is a fun storyline to talk about, and that's kind of been the point, is that this Bloodline story has continued and continued and continued. Sure, there have been some dips along the way. There have been some things where it's like, boy, are we still doing this with a Bloodline? But this now gives you a lot of fresh directions because of all the different players that they can add to the mix. And so, what I think you're setting up for here, based on what we saw on this week's SmackDown, I think you're going to get the two split, just like we said before, the Bloodline Civil War. You're going to get the two split factions. Solo, Tama Tonga, and my guess would be that Jacob Fatu is probably going to align with them while you have The Rock out. And then what are you going to get? After everything that's happened, you have to get the originals that come back together. They have to come back together to save what they created, right? Jimmy Uso just got kicked out at the hands of Solo Sikoa and Tama Tonga. Jey Uso, we know, is still out there, right? And I've seen some people hint in the SmackDown reaction show we did, maybe it's Jacob Fatu, who is the one who cost Jey Uso the championship opportunity against Damian Priest. It's a big opportunity for Jey, right? And it's not going to be Jimmy this time, so could it be Jacob Fatu? As that's where he makes his big debut to really tell us, hey, we're coming after basically the Bloodline original, right? And that's where you get Solo, Tama Tonga, Jacob Fatu aligned together as three. But does that bring the Usos back together? It's brother versus brother at WrestleMania. Sometimes you just got to fight as brothers and get it out of your system, but you still love each other, right? You still got to find a way to come back together to protect each other when it gets to that point. Could we get back to the Usos being aligned together? That would be my thought, is that it just makes too much sense now that they've both kind of been in similar situations. Jimmy gets kicked out here at the hands of Solo and Tama Tonga. So now, if we're saying this is the scenario that you play up, right? You've got Solo, you've got Tama Tonga, and you've got Jacob Fatu on one side. Let's say the Usos reunite. You got Jey Uso and Jimmy Uso on the other side. And there are going to be tag team combinations you can have in there, but ultimately you have a 3-on-2, right? I don't think the wise man Paul Heyman's going to be stepping in to team with the Usos, which leaves one man who could make his triumphant return to give us the Bloodline originals. And someone else in the SmackDown reaction had a great comment, which I thought they could definitely play this up. The Day One originals, right? For Roman Reigns, Jimmy Uso, and Jey Uso to all come back together, like I said a minute ago, to save the Bloodline. That is a great story that you could tell somehow. Now, look, I don't know how they get there with all the little tiny details, but you're telling me that a 6-man tag that you could have Roman Reigns and the Usos against Solo, Tama Tonga, Jacob Fatu, that would be tremendous. And maybe that's the SummerSlam match you get to on that. It's very possible. So that, I think, is what we're working towards. At least that's what they're hinting at already. Just in a couple segments on this week's SmackDown, I think you got a clear picture that this is where you're headed. You get Jimmy out of the picture, so now you know Jimmy's on the other side. We know Jay's still been on the other side. Roman is like the person that's just hanging out there, that we're not seeing him, but we know, based on how Solo and Tama Tonga responded backstage when Paul Heyman stepped out from checking on Jimmy, that they are following orders from a different tribal chief. And it's not the one that Paul Heyman thinks they're following orders from, and he knows that now, and that's where Heyman's facial expressions were tremendous here, because he really sold the story as he's watching Solo do everything he did in the ring, and of course he smashed the phone to call Roman Reigns. It was great. It was perfection in terms of how they executed it, and now, what does Heyman do? Until you get the reuniting maybe of the Usos, until you get the reuniting maybe of Roman Reigns and the Usos, what does Paul Heyman do in the meantime to try to figure out what's next? Does he still try to hang around with this sort of rogue bloodline with those guys? Who knows? But I think Solo's look of disgust at Heyman when he was calling Reigns, Solo's look of disgust after Roman could not finish things against Cody at WrestleMania 40, it gave us every indication that this is where they were headed, and I think you have a possibility to do a lot of great storytelling now on the road to WrestleMania 41, which, for me, probably still has to come with The Rock and Roman Reigns being the main event. I know, it kind of been reports out there, maybe they do Cody and Rock next year. But you know what, too? They could drag this Bloodline thing out for a couple more years based on the fresh matchups and the fresh stories. That's not going to sit well with everyone because there was a dip in that story until you had The Rock come back and kind of reignite things there. But if this is the way they're going to move forward, knowing that you're not going to have The Rock every week, you're not going to have Roman Reigns every week, now that puts Solo and everyone else in the biggest position of their careers because they have to be the ones now to carry this moving forward. And I thought they did a great job, at least in, step one, right, on SmackDown. They did a great job, I thought, of being in that role, making this feel like a very important story. And once again, what does it do? It adds a mystery as to what's next. And I think that's always important. And Triple H has always leaned into that kind of stuff. Leave people hanging with every time you feel like you've got an answer, you add a couple more questions. And now it is, who is the tribal chief? For Solo and Tama, like we said, we have a pretty good idea, but you leave those questions hanging out there. And I just think this has been tremendous, the way they've now decided to go with this, because it does give you a lot of fresh matches. Roman and Solo, Roman and Jacob Fatu, sign me up. You can do Roman and Tama Tonga. You can do the combination of the tag team matches like we said. Jimmy maybe goes one-on-one with one of those guys in there somewhere. You get the Usos tagging in two of the guys. Look at all the different match possibilities you have to work with now if this is the route they go. And then I think the big reveal has to be that it's The Rock, who is giving Roman the look after WrestleMania 40 as well, after he lost the match. They got that camera shot for a few minutes there, not even a few minutes, a few seconds, really looking at Rock, looking down on Reigns, and then they cut away to go back to Cody celebrating. But I think that's got to be it, right? Unless I don't know if they're going to just say, hey, Jacob Fatu's the tribal chief or Solo's the tribal chief, because remember, I know some people say, well, now clearly Solo is the tribal chief, but Solo also was the one that, kind of stepped up after Tama Tonga, said by orders of the tribal chief. And so I know people are asking the question, is it Solo? But I think that's the point. You want people to think it is Solo, when in reality, there's a great chance that it's actually the final boss himself and The Rock. So that's how I think you get to Roman Reigns versus The Rock next year's WrestleMania or whenever they decide to do it. So I thought this was a great development in the Bloodline storyline, and I would love to know what you guys think. What's next for the Bloodline moving forward? Are we going to get, as I called it originally, the Bloodline Originals versus the Bloodline Wolfpack? So this is like the NWO. You've got the Originals and the Wolfpack version. How is this thing going to unfold? Let me know your predictions and your thoughts in the comments section. Always enjoy the great feedback. I know we come up with all of these wild theories, but this is just what we enjoy doing. And I know you guys always give some great feedback on what you think is going to happen, and that's what's fun about this whole thing. So appreciate you guys watching as always. Hit the subscribe button. And what's next for the Bloodline? The Civil War is here. Who is going to align with who? That is the big question.